Emma Richardson had survived 2 combat zones through her father's stories, 3 foster homes, and 18 months at Riverside Preparatory Academy. But when Brandon Caldwell trapped her in the basement storage room during the Halloween dance, he had no idea she carried tactical training from the 75th Ranger Regiment that would turn his cruel power play into a nightmare that exposed a conspiracy reaching the school's highest donors in exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes. What started as another attempt to humiliate the scholarship Orphan became a federal investigation that revealed years of covered-up assaults, financial corruption, and a protection racket that had silenced victims for decades. By the end of this story, you'll discover how one girl's refusal to be another casualty brought down an entire network of privilege and power that thought itself untouchable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma's weathered duffel bag hit the polished marble floor of Riverside Preparatory Academy's main entrance with a thud that echoed through centuries of tradition and entitlement. October wind whipped through the Gothic archways as she stood in the shadow of Sterling Hall, watching Mercedes and BMWs drop-off students returning from weekend visits home. At 17, Emma Richardson carried herself with a stillness that most teenagers hadn't earned, her green eyes scanning the courtyard with the systematic awareness her father had drilled into her before his final deployment to Afghanistan. She wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, her scholarship covering tuition and room, but leaving little for the designer uniforms that marked social hierarchy at Riverside. The red brick buildings of Riverside Preparatory Academy rose like monuments to old money and older secrets, their ivy-covered walls hiding 150 years of Caldwell donations, Morrison scholarships, and Thompson endowments. The academy perched on 40 acres of Vermont mountainside, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry to Millfield's population of 8,000 below. Emma had learned this geography during her first week, the same systematic reconnaissance her father had taught her during their weekend camping trips when she was 12, and he was preparing her for a world where knowing your escape routes meant survival. What Emma didn't know as she climbed the worn stone steps to her dormitory was that Brandon Caldwell had been watching her since September, studying her routines with the patience of a predator who'd never faced real consequences. At 18, Brandon stood 6 feet 2 inches, with the build of someone who'd spent 4 years as varsity quarterback and 3 summers at his father's construction sites, learning that strength meant control. His father, Richard Caldwell, had built half of Millfield, including the academy's newest dormitory, and his quarterly donations kept Principal Victoria Hayes's budget comfortable and her questions minimal. Brandon commanded Riverside's social ecosystem through a combination of athletic achievement, financial influence, and carefully calculated cruelty. His inner circle consisted of Derek Thompson, whose grandfather endowed the library and whose father sat on the board of trustees, and Kyle Martinez, a tech prodigy whose hacking skills had covered their tracks through countless pranks that crossed lines into assault. Together they had perfected a system of selecting targets who couldn't fight back, isolating them systematically until they either transferred out or learned to stay invisible. Emma's first warning should have been the silence that fell over the Thornton Dining Hall when she entered for dinner that first week. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Designer utensils hesitated over plates of food that cost more than most families spent on groceries. Her roommate Sophia Chen, daughter of prominent surgeons from Boston, offered a look that combined sympathy with self-preservation. "You're the military scholarship girl," Sophia said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken rules. "Emma Richardson, right? Be careful here. Some people don't think certain kids belong." The scholarship that brought Emma to Riverside came from the Fallen Heroes Foundation, established for children of soldiers killed in action. Her father, Staff Sergeant Michael Richardson, had died when his convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar 2 years earlier. Her mother, Captain Sarah Richardson, had been killed in the same attack while serving as a combat medic. The foundation covered Emma's tuition, books, and basic room and board, but it also marked her as different in a place where difference was often treated as weakness. Emma's corner room in Sterling Hall had been carefully chosen by someone who understood isolation tactics. The narrow space overlooked the maintenance area rather than the scenic courtyard views that other students enjoyed. Her previous roommate had transferred out suddenly, leaving behind rumors of harassment that were never officially reported. Mrs. Susan Palmer, the dorm supervisor, had tried to prepare Emma during orientation. "Some of our families have been here for generations," she'd said carefully. "They have their own way of doing things. Best keep your head down and focus on your studies." But keeping her head down had never been Emma's strength. Her father had taught her that awareness meant survival, that predators targeted those who looked weak or distracted. During their weekend training sessions in the Green Mountains, he'd shown her how to read terrain, identify threats, and use an opponent's assumptions against them. "Most people see a small girl and think victim," he told her during a session on hand-to-hand combat. "Let them think that right up until the moment you prove them wrong." Emma's first month passed quietly as she established routines that maximized safety while maintaining the academic excellence her scholarship required. She woke at 0500 for a run through the mountain trails, avoiding the main paths where students gathered. Her classes were advanced placement courses that challenged her intellect while keeping her in smaller groups where teachers noticed individual students. She spent afternoons in the library's basement archives, researching academy history while staying away from common areas where social hierarchies played out. The harassment began subtly, as it always did. Emma's textbooks disappeared from her locker, forcing her to share with classmates who resented the imposition. Her laundry emerged from the dormitory machines stained with substances that didn't wash out, requiring her to replace clothes she couldn't afford. Her meal card stopped working randomly, leaving her hungry until Mrs. Palmer could sort out the, quote, technical difficulties that never affected other students. Emma documented everything in a journal her father had given her, recording dates, times, witnesses, and physical evidence with military precision. She photographed each incident, creating a digital trail that she backed up to encrypted cloud storage. When she reported the escalating harassment to Principal Hayes, she received the response that had protected Riverside's reputation for decades. "Brandon Caldwell is one of our finest students," Hayes had said, her tone suggesting Emma's concerns were both unfounded and inappropriate. "Perhaps you're having difficulty adjusting to our academic rigor and social expectations." But Emma wasn't adjusting poorly to academic rigor. She was maintaining a 4.0 GPA, while taking courses that challenged students with private tutoring and test preparation. Her chemistry teacher, Dr. Amanda Foster, had noted Emma's exceptional grasp of molecular structures and reaction principles. Her history instructor praised her research papers on military strategy. Her English teacher recommended her for advanced composition. Emma was succeeding academically while being systematically terrorized socially, a combination that made her both valuable to the Academy's statistics and dangerous to its social order. The first direct confrontation came during a late October study session in the library's basement archives. Emma had discovered the space during her initial reconnaissance, noting that it provided multiple exit routes and minimal foot traffic. She was researching the Academy's disciplinary records for a government class project when Brandon appeared in the narrow aisle between towering shelves. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere, filling the quiet space with predatory tension. "Well, well," Brandon said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences. "Little Emma, all alone in the basement. Studying hard to keep that charity scholarship?" His approach was methodical, designed to block her access to the main exit while forcing her deeper into the isolated stacks. Behind him, Derek and Kyle emerged from other aisles, creating a coordinated containment that spoke to practiced intimidation. Emma's training kicked in automatically. She assessed the space, identifying 3 potential exit routes and 2 improvised weapons within reach. Her breathing remained steady as she faced Brandon, her posture relaxed but ready. "Just researching Academy history," she replied calmly, her voice showing none of the fear they expected. Amazing how many disciplinary issues seemed to disappear from official records. The comment hit its mark. Brandon's casual mask slipped momentarily, revealing genuine anger underneath. "Maybe you're researching the wrong things," he said, stepping closer. "Maybe you should research what happens to scholarship kids who don't know their place." The threat was clear, but so was something else. Emma had touched on something that genuinely worried him. "My place is in these classes, earning grades that justify my scholarship," Emma responded, meeting his gaze steadily. "Just like your place is presumably earning grades that justify your father's donations." The statement hung in the air like a chemical reaction waiting for the right catalyst. She had just suggested that his academic success might be purchased rather than earned. Derek shifted nervously, recognizing that the confrontation was escalating beyond their usual script. "Brandon, maybe we should just go," he suggested, but Brandon ignored him. This wasn't following the pattern where targets cowered and submitted. Emma was treating him like an equal rather than an authority, and that fundamental disrespect demanded correction. "You think you're clever," Brandon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But clever doesn't protect you here. Money protects you. Connections protect you. Family name protects you. What protects you, scholarship girl?" The question was meant to highlight her vulnerability, to emphasize her isolation and dependence on institutional charity. Emma considered the question seriously, as if he'd asked about her study methods rather than delivered a threat. "Training protects me," she said simply. "Discipline protects me. Refusing to be a victim protects me." She gathered her research materials methodically, her movements showing no haste or fear. "And documenting everything protects me most of all. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. The response clearly wasn't what Brandon expected. Students were supposed to apologize, beg, or break down under pressure. They weren't supposed to reference training or documentation, concepts that suggested preparation for conflict rather than victim status. Kyle, who had been silent throughout the exchange, tugged at Brandon's sleeve. "Dude, she's recording something on her phone," he whispered urgently. Emma wasn't recording audio, but she had activated the GPS tracking and emergency beacon functions on her military-grade fitness tracker, devices her father had given her with instructions to use if she ever felt truly threatened. The tracker was designed for soldiers operating in hostile territory, with features that civilian devices lacked. It could transmit location data through multiple channels, record biometric stress indicators, and trigger automated emergency responses when certain thresholds were reached. Brandon's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he realized the confrontation wasn't proceeding according to his script. "Delete whatever you're recording," he demanded, reaching for her phone. "Now." But Emma had already stepped back, putting a table between them while maintaining visual contact with all three boys. "I'm not recording anything," she said truthfully, "but I am documenting our conversation for my research project on institutional power dynamics. Amazing how clear the patterns become when you study them systematically." She moved toward the exit with deliberate calm, but Brandon blocked her path again. "You think you can threaten me?" he snarled. "You think some scholarship orphan can threaten a Caldwell?" The words revealed more than he intended, showing that this wasn't random harassment but targeted elimination of someone who posed a specific threat to established order. "I'm not threatening anyone," Emma replied. "I'm just refusing to be intimidated." There's a difference, though I understand it might be hard to recognize if you're not familiar with the concept. The statement was delivered with clinical precision, designed to highlight his reliance on intimidation rather than legitimate authority. The insult landed perfectly. Brandon lunged forward, but Emma was already moving, using his momentum against him as her father had taught her. She sidestepped smoothly, letting him stumble past her while she gained access to the exit. "This isn't over," he called after her, his voice carrying genuine rage. "Not even close." Emma paused at the doorway, turning back to face the three boys who had expected an easy victim and instead found someone who refused to play their assigned role. "You're right," she agreed. "It's not over, but you might want to consider that some fights don't end the way you expect them to." Then she was gone, leaving them in the basement with the uncomfortable realization that their usual tactics had failed completely. That evening, Emma sat in her dormitory room documenting the encounter while Sophia pretended to study. Her roommate had heard about the library incident through the network of gossip that connected every corner of Riverside's social ecosystem. "Emma," Sophia said quietly, "maybe you should just apologize to Brandon. Make this go away before it gets worse." Emma looked up from her journal, considering the suggestion seriously. Apologizing would certainly be the path of least resistance, the strategy most likely to restore social equilibrium and allow her to complete her education without further conflict. But it would also validate every assumption about power dynamics that made Riverside's culture possible. "What exactly should I apologize for?" Emma asked. "Studying in the library, refusing to be intimidated, suggesting that academic success should be earned rather than purchased." The questions highlighted the absurdity of apologizing for basic rights that should be unquestioned. Sophia fidgeted with her textbook, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. You know what I mean. Just say you're sorry for being disrespectful. Brandon's family basically owns this place. He can make your life impossible here. The warning was delivered with genuine concern, but it also revealed the extent to which students had internalized the academy's power structure. His family donates money to this place, Emma corrected. That doesn't mean they own me or my right to be here. My scholarship is based on merit and need, not on anyone's charity or goodwill. She returned to her documentation, recording Sophia's warning as additional evidence of the systematic intimidation that protected certain students while victimizing others. Outside their window, October wind rattled through bare branches as Vermont's early winter approached. The sound reminded Emma of night patrols her father had described, when every noise could signal danger and survival depended on constant awareness. She was beginning to understand that Riverside Preparatory Academy operated like hostile territory, where different rules applied to different people, and where showing weakness invited predation. Emma's research into academy history had revealed patterns that extended back decades. Students from wealthy families seemed to graduate despite disciplinary issues that would have resulted in expulsion for scholarship recipients. Incidents involving assault, harassment, and academic dishonesty were consistently resolved through private meetings rather than official proceedings. Former students had transferred out suddenly, after filing complaints that were never formally investigated. The system protected itself through a combination of financial dependence and social isolation. Families who challenged the academy's decisions found their children ostracized and their concerns dismissed. Teachers who advocated too strongly for victimized students discovered that their contracts weren't renewed. The message was clear: accept the social order or face consequences that extended beyond individual punishment. But Emma had advantages that previous targets lacked. Her military background had taught her to document everything, think strategically, and never depend entirely on official protection. Her scholarship came from a federal foundation rather than academy discretion, making it harder to revoke arbitrarily. Most importantly, she had been trained by someone who understood that appearing weak was sometimes the best strategy for defeating a stronger opponent. As she prepared for sleep that night, Emma activated the security features on her fitness tracker and reviewed the emergency protocols her father had taught her. Tomorrow would bring escalation, as bullies like Brandon couldn't tolerate challenges to their authority without responding with increased force. But Emma had survived worse things than wealthy teenagers with anger management issues. She had survived losing both parents, navigating foster care, and adapting to environments where she was unwanted. The difference was that this time, she wasn't just surviving. This time, she was gathering evidence, building cases, and preparing for a confrontation that would force Riverside Preparatory Academy to choose between protecting its reputation and protecting its culture of systematic abuse. And Emma had learned from her father that when institutions were forced to make that choice, they often discovered that their reputation depended on changing their culture rather than hiding it. The escalation came with October's final week, when Riverside Preparatory Academy's traditions collided with Emma's refusal to accept her assigned place in the social hierarchy. The Halloween Masquerade Ball represented everything the academy stood for, a centuries-old celebration where wealthy families displayed their children like valuable commodities while maintaining the pretense of academic excellence. Emma had planned to skip the mandatory event, but Principal Hayes made attendance a requirement for scholarship recipients, citing "community engagement" as essential to their continued enrollment. Emma understood the strategy immediately. Forcing her to attend an event where she couldn't afford appropriate attire would highlight her outsider status while providing Brandon and his allies with opportunities for public humiliation. The masquerade theme added another layer of symbolic violence, as students were expected to wear elaborate costumes that cost more than Emma's monthly stipend. She solved the problem with characteristic resourcefulness, creating a simple black mask and wearing her only formal dress, a plain navy outfit her foster mother had bought for court appearances. The transformation of Thornton Hall into a Gothic ballroom showcased the Academy's commitment to maintaining appearances. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls decorated with harvest themes, while a professional catering staff served delicacies that most students took for granted. Faculty members mingled with visiting parents and board members, their conversations carefully avoiding topics that might disturb the evening's carefully orchestrated elegance. Emma positioned herself near the exit, observing social dynamics while remaining ready to leave if the situation became untenable. Brandon's entrance commanded attention, as intended. His custom costume portrayed a medieval knight, complete with authentic armor that probably cost more than most families earned in a month. Derek followed as his squire, while Kyle played the court jester, roles that perfectly reflected their real-world relationship. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Brandon saw himself as nobility, entitled to rule over peasants who existed for his amusement or elimination. The first hour passed without direct confrontation, allowing Emma to study the intricate social choreography that governed Riverside's elite culture. Conversations flowed around topics that excluded scholarship students by design, references to summer homes in the Hamptons, ski trips to Switzerland, and college connections that bypassed merit-based admissions. Faculty members laughed at jokes they clearly didn't find funny, their tenure dependent on maintaining relationships with families who could destroy careers with a single phone call. Emma's military training had taught her to recognize the difference between strength and performance, and everything about the Halloween celebration screamed performance. The elaborate costumes masked insecurity rather than confidence, while the forced gaiety concealed underlying tensions between families competing for social dominance. She documented these observations in her mental notes, understanding that social dynamics often revealed institutional vulnerabilities. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chemistry teacher who had praised Emma's academic performance, approached during a quiet moment between dance sets. Her witch costume was modest compared to other faculty outfits, suggesting either personal preference or financial constraints that Emma recognized from her own experience. "You look like you're analyzing rather than enjoying," Dr. Foster observed with gentle humor. "Just trying to understand the social chemistry," Emma replied, appreciating the teacher's subtle concern. "Some reactions are more predictable than others." The comment carried double meaning, acknowledging both the evening's artificial atmosphere and Emma's growing understanding of the forces that governed academy life. Dr. Foster glanced around the ballroom, her expression suggesting shared reservations about the evening's proceedings. "Chemistry can be dangerous when you mix incompatible elements," she said quietly. "Sometimes the most stable compounds are formed through gradual processes rather than explosive reactions." The warning was carefully disguised as academic discussion, but Emma understood the underlying message about avoiding confrontation with volatile personalities. The conversation ended abruptly when Brandon materialized beside them, his night costume lending artificial authority to his natural arrogance. "Dr. Foster," he said with practiced charm, "thank you for such an engaging chemistry class. I particularly enjoyed your discussion of unstable compounds." His smile was perfect, but his eyes carried a message meant specifically for Emma. "Chemistry is fascinating when studied properly," Dr. Foster replied carefully, recognizing the subtext but unable to address it directly. "Understanding reaction principles helps predict outcomes." She excused herself diplomatically, leaving Emma alone with Brandon while maintaining plausible deniability about any warnings she might have intended. Brandon's approach shifted immediately once they were isolated. The charming mask he wore for authority figures dissolved, revealing the predatory calculation that drove his interactions with vulnerable targets. "Enjoying the ball, scholarship girl?" he asked, his voice carrying mock concern. "I hope you're not feeling out of place among your betters." Emma had anticipated this moment throughout the evening, understanding that Brandon's ego required public demonstration of his dominance over her. The ballroom setting provided perfect cover for harassment disguised as social interaction, while the masquerade theme added symbolic elements that he would find irresistible. "I'm here because attendance is mandatory," she replied honestly. "Just like everyone else who doesn't have a choice." The response surprised him as it suggested awareness of coercion rather than gratitude for inclusion. Students were supposed to feel honored by invitations to academy events, not resentful of forced participation. "Choice is a luxury earned through contribution," Brandon said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he'd inherited from generations of Caldwell privilege. "Some people contribute family legacy, others contribute athletic achievement, and others contribute financial support. What exactly do you contribute besides taking up space meant for more deserving students?" Emma considered the question seriously. understanding that her response would determine the evening's trajectory. She could apologize, deflect, or withdraw, all strategies that would preserve immediate peace while validating his assumptions about power dynamics. Alternatively, she could challenge his premise directly, an approach that would escalate conflict but might expose the institutional corruption that protected his behavior. I contribute academic excellence without requiring family donations to maintain it, Emma said clearly, her voice carrying across nearby conversations. I contribute perspectives that come from earning opportunities rather than inheriting them. And I contribute documentation of interesting social dynamics that some people might prefer to keep hidden. The final statement was delivered with clinical precision, designed to highlight his dependence on concealment rather than legitimate authority. The ballroom seemed to pause around them as nearby students registered the confrontation developing between the academy's most powerful student and its most vulnerable. Some moved closer, drawn by the possibility of witnessing Emma's destruction, while others retreated to avoid association with whatever consequences might follow. The social mathematics were clear. Emma was committing academic suicide by challenging Brandon publicly. Derek appeared beside Brandon with practiced timing, his squire costume perfect for the role of loyal enforcer. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone suggesting that problems could be solved through application of appropriate pressure. Behind him, Kyle recorded the interaction on his phone, preparing to document Emma's humiliation for later distribution through social media channels. "No problem," Emma replied calmly, understanding that retreat was no longer possible without complete surrender. "Just discussing the different ways students contribute to academy culture. Apparently some contributions are more valued than others, regardless of their actual merit or legality." The statement was carefully crafted to suggest knowledge of specific wrongdoing without making accusations that could be easily dismissed. Brandon's face flushed beneath his knight's mask, anger overriding the calculated control that usually governed his public behavior. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice rising enough to attract unwanted attention from faculty chaperones. "Maybe it's time someone taught you about respect and knowing your place." The threat was clear enough that nearby students began backing away, recognizing the signs that preceded Brandon's more serious demonstrations of power. Emma remained stationary, her posture relaxed but ready, drawing on training that had prepared her for situations where retreat meant greater danger than standing firm. Her fitness tracker monitored her elevated heart rate while activating GPS tracking protocols that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. Principal Hayes materialized with the timing of someone who had been monitoring the situation from a distance, her elegant costume doing nothing to disguise the calculating intelligence that had protected Riverside's reputation through decades of potential scandals. "Is everything all right here?" she asked with false concern, her question directed toward Brandon rather than Emma, despite the obvious power imbalance. "Just discussing academic philosophy," Brandon replied smoothly, his public mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. Emma was sharing some interesting theories about contribution and merit. Very enlightening perspectives. His smile was perfect, but his eyes promised consequences that would extend far beyond the evening's festivities. Principal Hayes studied Emma with the expression of someone evaluating potential threats to institutional stability. "I'm sure Emma appreciates the opportunity to engage with her fellow students," she said carefully. "Perhaps this would be a good time for her to help with cleanup preparation in the basement storage areas. Community service is such an important part of the scholarship experience." The assignment was clearly designed to isolate Emma from potential witnesses while providing Brandon and his allies with unsupervised access to her. Emma understood the trap immediately, recognizing that refusal would provide justification for disciplinary action, while compliance would eliminate the protection of public visibility. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of impossible choice. "Of course," Emma agreed, maintaining eye contact with Principal Hayes while accepting the assignment that everyone present understood was actually a sentencing. "I'd be happy to contribute to community cleanup. When should I report to the basement?" Her compliance surprised those who expected resistance. But Emma had learned that sometimes the best strategy involved allowing opponents to expose themselves fully. "Immediately would be perfect," Principal Hayes replied, her relief obvious to anyone who understood institutional dynamics. "The custodial staff could use assistance preparing storage areas for tomorrow's cleanup crews. I'm sure Brandon and his friends would be happy to show you the way. given their familiarity with academy facilities. The suggestion was presented as helpfulness rather than coordination of harassment, maintaining plausible deniability for all authority figures involved. Emma gathered her simple black mask and followed Brandon, Derek, and Kyle toward the basement access that most students had never seen. The route took them through service corridors designed for maintenance rather than student use, areas where security cameras were sparse and sound didn't carry to occupied portions of the building. Her fitness tracker continued monitoring her location and vital signs, creating a digital record that would prove invaluable in the coming hours. The basement of the academic center existed in a different world from the elegant spaces above, featuring concrete walls, industrial lighting, and the mechanical systems that supported Riverside's facade of effortless perfection. Storage rooms lined narrow corridors, filled with everything from old furniture to maintenance supplies to archived records that the academy preferred to keep hidden from public scrutiny. Emma noted multiple exit routes while appearing to focus on Brandon's increasingly aggressive commentary. "This is where people like you belong," Brandon said, as they descended deeper into the basement labyrinth. "Underground, invisible, handling the dirty work that keeps better people comfortable." His night costume looked absurd in the industrial setting, highlighting the disconnect between his assumed authority and actual capability. Derek and Kyle flanked Emma as they walked, their positioning designed to prevent escape while maintaining the pretense of friendly guidance. "Nothing personal," Derek said with false sympathy, "just academy tradition. New scholarship kids need to understand how things work here." His squire costume emphasized his role as Brandon's loyal enforcer, someone who derived status from proximity to power rather than personal achievement. Kyle remained silent, focused on his phone, where he was presumably coordinating with other students or documenting Emma's march toward whatever lesson Brandon had planned. His jester costume was perfect for his role as chronicler of humiliation, someone whose technical skills made him valuable despite his obvious personal inadequacies. The basement setting would provide perfect acoustics for recording audio that could be edited to eliminate context while preserving humiliation. Emma's military training had taught her to recognize the signs of approaching violence, and everything about the current situation screamed danger. The isolation was complete, the power imbalance overwhelming, and the institutional protection non-existent. Her opponents had planned this carefully, choosing timing and location that maximized their advantages while minimizing potential consequences. But they had also made assumptions about her capabilities that were about to prove dangerously incorrect. The storage room they selected was perfect for their purposes. A narrow space filled with obsolete furniture and cleaning supplies that would muffle sound while providing psychological intimidation through claustrophobic conditions. A single overhead bulb provided harsh lighting that cast dramatic shadows, while thick concrete walls eliminated any possibility of outside intervention. Brandon gestured toward the interior with mock politeness, his intentions becoming unmistakably clear. "After you," he said with exaggerated courtesy. "Time for your real orientation to academy life." The statement carried implications that extended far beyond simple intimidation, suggesting physical violence that had been carefully planned rather than spontaneous aggression. Emma understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her immediate safety, but her entire future at Riverside Preparatory Academy. She stepped into the storage room with apparent compliance, drawing her three tormentors into the confined space where their numerical advantage would be offset by restricted movement and limited escape routes. Her fitness tracker registered her spiking heart rate while automatically activating emergency protocols that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose decades of covered-up violence and institutional corruption. Brandon closed the storage room door behind them with deliberate ceremony, the sound echoing through concrete walls like a judge's gavel announcing sentence. The space immediately felt smaller, more threatening, as four people occupied an area designed for equipment storage rather than human interaction. Emma positioned herself near a stack of chairs that could serve as improvised weapons or barriers, her movements appearing nervous while actually implementing tactical positioning her father had drilled into her during weekend training sessions. "Now we can talk privately," Brandon said, his voice taking on the casual cruelty that marked his interactions when authority figures weren't present to maintain his public facade. "No teachers, no administrators, no witnesses. Just us and some long overdue education about respect and social hierarchy." He removed his knight's helmet with theatrical flair, revealing the predatory smile that had terrorized scholarship students for years. Derek positioned himself near the door, blocking the obvious exit route while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. His squire costume emphasized his role as Brandon's loyal enforcer, someone whose status depended entirely on proximity to inherited power rather than personal achievement. "Nothing personal," he repeated with false sympathy. "Just making sure you understand how things work here before you make any more mistakes." Kyle activated his phone's recording function while positioning himself to capture optimal audio and video footage. His jester costume was perfect for his role as chronicler of humiliation, someone whose technical skills made him valuable despite obvious personal inadequacies. The storage room's concrete walls would provide perfect acoustics for recording sound that could be edited to eliminate context while preserving Emma's submission or distress. Emma understood that the next few minutes would determine everything, not just her immediate safety, but the entire power structure that governed Riverside Preparatory Academy. Her opponents had planned this carefully, choosing timing and location that maximized their advantages while minimizing potential consequences. But they had also made assumptions about her capabilities that were about to prove catastrophically incorrect. "I'm listening," Emma said calmly, her voice showing none of the fear they expected. Instead of cowering or pleading, she stood with the relaxed alertness her father had taught her during combat preparation, weight balanced on both feet and hands free for defensive movement. Her apparent calm clearly unsettled Brandon, who had expected tears or begging by this point in the process. Brandon stepped closer, using his height and bulk to create physical intimidation in the confined space. "The lesson is simple," he said, his voice dropping to the whisper that had preceded violence against previous victims. "Scholarship kids exist here because we allow it. You eat because we pay for it. You sleep in our dormitories because our families built them. And when you forget your place, we remind you." The speech was clearly rehearsed, polished through repetition against previous targets who had lacked Emma's training and preparation. Brandon expected submission, apology, or breakdown at this point, standard responses that validated his assumptions about power and control. Instead, Emma listened with the clinical attention she might give to a chemistry lecture, analyzing his words for useful information about academy dynamics. "Interesting theory," Emma replied thoughtfully, as if he had presented an academic argument rather than delivered a threat. "But I'm curious about the legal framework that supports this social structure. Last time I checked, assault and imprisonment were federal crimes regardless of family donation levels." Her response transformed their power dynamic, treating his threats as topics for intellectual discussion rather than sources of terror. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Brandon's face flushed with anger while Derek shifted nervously near the door, clearly uncomfortable with Emma's refusal to follow their established script. Kyle continued recording but appeared uncertain about whether the footage would serve their intended purpose of documenting humiliation. None of them had experience with targets who analyzed their behavior, rather than submitting to it. "You think you're clever," Brandon snarled, abandoning pretense as his carefully maintained control began cracking under pressure. "But clever doesn't protect you when you're locked in a basement with people who can make you disappear." The threat was explicit enough to constitute criminal intimidation, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for escalating violence. Emma's training had prepared her for exactly this moment, when predators revealed their true intentions and abandoned any pretense of lawful behavior. Her fitness tracker was recording everything while transmitting location data and biometric information to emergency services through channels her father had programmed, specifically for situations where conventional help might not arrive in time. But she also understood that survival often depended on allowing opponents to expose themselves completely before taking defensive action. "Make me disappear?" Emma repeated with genuine curiosity, as if he had proposed an interesting magic trick rather than threatened murder. "That's quite an ambitious plan. Have you worked out the logistics, or are you just improvising?" Her questions highlighted the gap between his violent fantasies and practical reality, forcing him to confront the difference between inherited privilege and actual capability. The storage room fell silent except for the mechanical hum of building systems and Kyle's phone recording what was clearly becoming something other than the humiliation video they had planned. Emma's refusal to be intimidated was forcing them into territory none of them had prepared for, where their usual tactics were proving ineffective against someone who treated their threats as academic subjects rather than sources of terror. Brandon lunged forward with the sudden violence that had characterized his attacks on previous victims. But Emma was already moving, using his momentum against him exactly as her father had taught her during hand-to-hand combat training. She sidestepped smoothly while striking pressure points that temporarily disabled his left arm, techniques designed to neutralize larger opponents through precision rather than strength. Derek rushed to assist his leader but found himself facing someone whose military training had prepared her for multiple attackers in confined spaces. Emma used the storage room's furniture to create barriers and leverage, turning their numerical advantage into a liability as they interfered with each other's movements. Kyle abandoned his recording to join the attack, but his technical skills provided no preparation for physical confrontation with someone who had been trained by elite military personnel. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds, ending with all three boys on the concrete floor while Emma stood ready for continued action. Her fitness tracker had recorded the entire encounter while transmitting emergency signals that were already mobilizing responses they couldn't imagine. But more importantly, she had documented their premeditated plan to assault and possibly murder a scholarship student, evidence that would destroy the protective network that had shielded them for years. Brandon struggled to his feet, his night costume torn, and his ego shattered by the realization that his assumptions about power and capability had proven disastrously wrong. "You're dead," he gasped, his voice carrying genuine fear for the first time in years. "My father will have you arrested, expelled, disappeared. No one attacks a Caldwell and survives." Emma looked down at him with the same clinical attention she had given his earlier threats, analyzing his words for useful information about the corruption that protected academy culture. "Interesting," she said calmly. "So you're admitting that your family has made people disappear before? That sounds like something law enforcement might want to investigate thoroughly." The implication hit Derek and Kyle simultaneously, as they realized their leader had just confessed to conspiracy and possibly murder, while being recorded on multiple devices. The storage room that was supposed to contain Emma's humiliation had instead captured evidence of systematic criminal activity that reached far beyond simple bullying. Their plan to silence one scholarship student had instead created documentation that would bring down the entire network of corruption and violence that had protected Riverside's elite families for decades. Kyle reached for his phone to delete the recording, but Emma was faster, her military training having taught her to secure evidence before opponents could destroy it. The device now contained proof of premeditated assault, criminal conspiracy, and institutional cover-up that would prove invaluable in the federal investigation that was already beginning to mobilize in response to her emergency beacon. "You can't use that," Derek said desperately, understanding that their recorded confessions would destroy not just their own futures, but their families' reputations and possibly their freedom. "We're minors, this is privileged, you can't record us without permission." His legal arguments revealed sophisticated understanding of privacy laws that suggested previous experience with situations requiring evidence suppression. Emma studied the three boys who had planned to assault and possibly murder her, noting how quickly their arrogance had transformed into panic once they realized the true consequences of their actions. "Actually," she said with the precision of someone who had researched relevant laws thoroughly, "Vermont is a one-party consent state for recording, and you forfeited any reasonable expectation of privacy the moment you committed felony assault and kidnapping." The storage room door suddenly burst open as emergency responders arrived with timing that seemed impossible unless someone had been monitoring the situation remotely. Vermont State Police officers flooded the confined space with weapons drawn, followed immediately by FBI agents whose presence indicated federal jurisdiction over what had appeared to be a simple school incident. Emma's emergency beacon had triggered protocols designed for military personnel in hostile territory, bringing resources that local authorities couldn't have mobilized independently. Brandon, Derek, and Kyle found themselves face down on concrete, with federal agents reading them rights that their family money couldn't override, while Emma provided clear, detailed statements about the premeditated nature of their attack and the institutional protection that had enabled years of similar violence. The storage room that was meant to hide her disappearance had instead become the crime scene that would expose decades of covered-up brutality and corruption. Outside the basement, Riverside Preparatory Academy was about to discover that some secrets were too explosive to contain, and some students were too well trained to disappear quietly into the darkness that had swallowed their predecessors. The emergency response that descended upon Riverside Preparatory Academy transformed a quiet Vermont evening into a federal crime scene with precision that stunned everyone who witnessed it. Agent Sarah Martinez of the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children unit had been monitoring the emergency beacon data from Emma's military-grade fitness tracker for the past 27 minutes, watching biometric indicators that told a story of escalating danger followed by explosive physical confrontation. The device's sophisticated sensors had detected everything from elevated stress hormones to impact patterns consistent with hand-to-hand combat, creating a digital record that would prove invaluable in the prosecution ahead. The response protocol Emma's father had programmed into her tracker was designed for military personnel operating in hostile territory, not teenage girls attending elite boarding schools, but the system worked exactly as intended. Multiple agencies received simultaneous alerts through channels that bypassed local dispatch systems, ensuring that family influence couldn't delay or redirect the investigation. Vermont State Police arrived first, followed within minutes by FBI agents from the Burlington field office, while specialized tactical units prepared for scenarios ranging from active shooters to hostage situations. Agent Martinez commanded the scene with the efficiency of someone who had investigated hundreds of cases involving violence against vulnerable victims. Her team secured the basement storage room as a crime scene while paramedics evaluated Emma for injuries that, thankfully, proved minor, despite the intensity of the recorded confrontation. The three boys who had planned Emma's assault found themselves separated into different vehicles, their Miranda rights delivered with professional precision that made clear this wasn't a school disciplinary matter, but a federal criminal investigation. Brandon Caldwell's transformation from academy royalty to federal suspect provided a stark lesson in how quickly inherited privilege could evaporate when confronted with actual law enforcement. His torn night costume and bruised ego made him appear pathetic rather than powerful, as Agent Martinez explained the charges he was facing. Conspiracy to commit assault, attempted kidnapping, criminal threatening, and civil rights violations, she enumerated with clinical precision. These are federal crimes, Mr. Caldwell, prosecuted in federal court, regardless of your family's local influence. Derek Thompson discovered that his grandfather's library endowment provided no protection against charges of conspiracy and assault, while Kyle Martinez learned that his technical skills had instead created evidence of premeditation that would enhance rather than reduce his sentence. The phone recordings they had intended to use for humiliation instead documented their criminal planning and Emma's lawful self-defense, creating an irrefutable record of their intentions and actions. Principal Victoria Hayes emerged from the Halloween ball to find her carefully managed academy transformed into an active crime scene, with federal agents processing evidence that threatened to expose decades of institutional corruption. Her elegant costume looked absurd as she attempted to assert administrative authority over investigators who operated under federal jurisdiction. "This is highly irregular," she protested to Agent Martinez. "These are internal academy matters that should be handled through appropriate disciplinary channels." Agent Martinez studied Principal Hayes with the expression of someone who had encountered institutional obstruction countless times throughout her career. "Ma'am, conspiracy to commit violent felonies isn't an internal matter," she replied with professional courtesy that carried unmistakable steel. "When students are systematically targeted for assault based on their economic status, that becomes a federal civil rights investigation. We'll need access to all disciplinary records, security footage, and communications related to scholarship students." The principal's face paled as she realized the scope of federal interest in academy operations. "I'm afraid that's confidential educational information protected by privacy laws," she said. But her voice lacked conviction. Agent Martinez smiled with the confidence of someone who understood exactly which laws applied to which situations. "Educational privacy laws don't protect criminal conspiracy," Martinez explained patiently. "And they certainly don't protect institutions that enable systematic violence against protected classes. We have warrants being prepared as we speak, but cooperation now might demonstrate good faith that could benefit the academy during the investigation." The offer was delivered as professional courtesy rather than negotiation, making clear that cooperation was preferable but not necessary. Meanwhile, in the basement storage room that had been intended as Emma's prison, FBI forensic specialists documented evidence that told a story of premeditated violence transformed into lawful self-defense. The positioning of furniture, the blood evidence, and the recorded audio created a clear narrative that contradicted any potential claims of mutual combat or accidental injury. Emma's military training had prepared her to disable attackers while minimizing permanent damage, a restraint that would prove crucial in demonstrating the defensive rather than aggressive nature of her actions. Dr. Amanda Foster, the chemistry teacher who had tried to warn Emma about dangerous social chemistry, watched the federal response with a mixture of relief and regret. She had suspected that Brandon's behavior extended beyond typical bullying, but institutional pressure had prevented her from reporting concerns that might have prevented the evening's violence. "I should have done more," she confided to Agent Martinez during her witness interview. There were signs, patterns, other students who seemed afraid. Agent Martinez had heard similar confessions throughout her career, understanding how institutional culture could silence potential advocates for vulnerable students. "You're helping now," she replied with genuine sympathy. "Your observations about student behavior patterns will be valuable in understanding how this situation developed." The reassurance was both professional courtesy and tactical psychology, encouraging cooperation that would strengthen the federal case. The dormitory where Emma's room had been systematically invaded and vandalized became another crime scene as agents documented evidence of harassment that extended far beyond the evening's assault. Sophia Chen, Emma's roommate, provided detailed testimony about months of intimidation tactics designed to isolate Emma from potential support networks. "They made it clear that helping her meant becoming a target yourself," Sophia explained with tears of guilt and relief. "The system protected them, not us." Emma's journal, with its careful documentation of harassment incidents and administrative responses, provided a roadmap of institutional failure that extended far beyond individual criminal behavior. Each dismissed complaint, each boys will be boys excuse, each instance of victim blaming had created a paper trail that federal prosecutors would use to demonstrate systematic civil rights violations. Agent Martinez recognized the military precision of Emma's record-keeping, understanding that her father's training had prepared her for exactly this type of evidence preservation. The technical analysis of Kyle's phone revealed communications that exposed a network of harassment extending far beyond the three primary suspects. Group chats contained detailed planning for what they euphemistically called orientation sessions for scholarship students, revealing a systematic campaign of violence that had been covered up through family influence and institutional complicity. The digital evidence painted a picture of organized cruelty that had operated with impunity for years. Richard Caldwell arrived at the academy within an hour of his son's arrest, accompanied by lawyers whose expensive suits couldn't overcome the reality of federal jurisdiction and overwhelming evidence. His usual strategy of leveraging financial influence against local authorities proved useless against FBI agents who operated under federal authority and Justice Department oversight. "This is obviously a misunderstanding," he declared to Agent Martinez. Boys being boys, typical teenage conflicts blown out of proportion by an unstable scholarship student. Agent Martinez had encountered wealthy parents attempting to minimize their children's criminal behavior countless times throughout her career, but the evidence in Emma's case was particularly overwhelming. "Mr. Caldwell," she replied with professional patience, "your son and his associates planned and attempted to execute a violent assault against a 17-year-old girl. The victim's military training allowed her to defend herself, but the premeditated nature of the attack is clearly documented. This isn't a misunderstanding or typical teenage conflict." The revelation that Emma possessed military combat training surprised Richard Caldwell, who had apparently assumed that scholarship students lacked resources or capabilities for effective resistance. His son's version of events had omitted the tactical disadvantage they had faced, focusing instead on the humiliation of being defeated by someone they had considered helpless. "Military training?" he repeated with confusion. "She's just a scholarship orphan." Agent Martinez studied Richard Caldwell with interest, noting how his assumptions about Emma's capabilities revealed broader attitudes that had enabled his son's criminal behavior. "Sir, underestimating people based on their economic status or family circumstances can lead to serious miscalculations," she observed with dry professionalism. "Your son discovered that tonight, and now he's facing federal charges as a result." The academic building that housed the storage room where the assault had occurred became the center of a forensic investigation that revealed evidence of previous incidents that had been successfully covered up. Maintenance records showed repeated repairs to storage areas following unexplained damage, while security camera footage revealed suspicious gaps during times when scholarship students had reported harassment. The pattern suggested systematic evidence destruction that would itself constitute federal obstruction charges. Mrs. Susan Palmer, the dorm supervisor who had genuinely cared about Emma's welfare, provided crucial testimony about administrative pressure to minimize harassment reports and avoid creating documentation that might attract external scrutiny. We were told that too many incident reports would hurt the Academy's reputation and endanger everyone's employment, she explained to federal investigators. Students like Emma were supposed to adapt rather than complain. The Halloween ball continued in surreal fashion as parents and board members pretended to enjoy festivities while federal agents processed evidence just floors below their celebration. Conversations became strained as news of the arrests spread through social media channels, forcing families to confront the reality that their donations had protected systematic criminal behavior rather than academic excellence. The cognitive dissonance was particularly acute for parents who had convinced themselves that their financial contributions supported education rather than enabling violence. Emma's emergency response had activated protocols that extended far beyond local law enforcement, triggering federal investigations into systematic civil rights violations that could expose criminal liability for Academy administrators, board members, and donor families who had enabled harassment campaigns. The military-grade fitness tracker that her father had given her for protection had created digital evidence that civilian devices couldn't have generated, transforming what might have been a he-said-she-said dispute into a federal case with overwhelming documentation. Dr. James Morrison, whose endowment funded the library where Emma had first confronted Brandon, discovered that his family's charitable contributions had inadvertently supported an institution that systematically violated the civil rights of vulnerable students. The revelation forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about due diligence and institutional oversight that extended far beyond simple financial generosity. "We thought we were supporting education," he confided to his wife as they left the academy under federal surveillance. "How could we have been so blind?" The transformation of Riverside Preparatory Academy from elite educational institution to federal crime scene provided a stark lesson in how quickly institutional reputations could collapse when underlying corruption was exposed to public scrutiny. Parents who had paid premium tuition for prestige and networking opportunities suddenly found themselves associated with systematic violence and civil rights violations that would dominate news coverage for months ahead. Agent Martinez recognized the broader implications of Emma's case, understanding that successful prosecution would send a message to elite institutions nationwide about federal commitment to protecting vulnerable students regardless of their economic status or the influence of their attackers. "This case will be studied," she told her team as they processed evidence. "Every boarding school, every private academy, every institution that thinks wealth provides immunity from civil rights laws will be watching what happens here." The basement storage room that Brandon had chosen for Emma's imprisonment had instead become the crime scene that would destroy the protective network that had enabled years of systematic abuse. The concrete walls that were supposed to muffle her screams had instead contained evidence of criminal conspiracy that federal prosecutors would use to demonstrate institutional civil rights violations, extending far beyond individual assault charges. Emma's refusal to be intimidated had triggered a federal response that would transform not just Riverside Preparatory Academy, but the entire landscape of accountability for elite educational institutions. Her father's military training had prepared her to survive the assault, but more importantly, it had taught her to document everything and trust in systems designed to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As Vermont State Police transported Brandon, Derek, and Kyle to federal detention facilities, their confident assumptions about immunity and privilege gave way to the reality of orange jumpsuits and court-appointed attorneys. The storage room that was supposed to hide Emma's disappearance had instead exposed a network of corruption that federal prosecutors would spend months unraveling, touching lives and institutions far beyond the Vermont mountains where their crimes had been committed. The Halloween masks that had provided symbolic cover for the evening's planned violence had been stripped away, revealing the true faces of institutional corruption that had operated with impunity for far too long. Emma's tactical training had turned predators into prey, but more importantly, her courage had opened a window into systematic abuse that federal authorities would ensure remained open until justice had been fully served. Agent Martinez understood that Emma's case represented something larger than individual criminal behavior, a systematic pattern of institutional protection for wealthy perpetrators that violated fundamental principles of equal justice under law. The evidence collected from Riverside Preparatory Academy would support charges that extended far beyond assault and conspiracy, potentially including civil rights violations that carried decades of federal prison time for those who had enabled and concealed systematic violence against vulnerable students. The Academy's carefully maintained facade of academic excellence and moral leadership had been shattered in a single evening, revealing an underlying culture of cruelty and corruption that federal oversight would ensure could never be rebuilt. Emma's refusal to disappear quietly into the darkness had instead illuminated institutional failures that demanded systematic reform and individual accountability at the highest levels. Outside the Gothic windows of Sterling Hall, October wind carried the sound of federal vehicles and helicopters that would soon transport evidence to laboratories, where scientific analysis would transform tonight's violence into tomorrow's convictions. The isolation that had protected Riverside's crimes for decades had been breached permanently, opening the Academy to scrutiny that would continue until every victim had been heard and every perpetrator held accountable. Emma's journey from invisible scholarship student to federal witness had taken less than 4 hours, but the consequences would ripple through elite educational institutions for years to come. Her father's training had saved her life, but her courage had saved countless future students who would never face the systematic violence that had been normalized at Riverside Preparatory Academy until federal law enforcement arrived to restore the rule of law that wealth and influence had temporarily suspended. The federal courthouse in Burlington, Vermont had never seen a case quite like United States versus Caldwell, Thompson, Martinez, and Riverside Preparatory Academy. 6 months after the Halloween night that changed everything, Emma Richardson sat in the witness chair facing a courtroom packed with media, legal observers, and families whose children had suffered similar abuse at elite institutions across the country. Her testimony would span 3 days, methodically dismantling the defense strategies that expensive legal teams had crafted to protect their clients from the consequences of systematic violence and institutional corruption. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had built her reputation prosecuting civil rights cases, but Emma's situation presented unique elements that would reshape how federal law addressed violence in educational settings. The combination of premeditated assault, institutional conspiracy, and civil rights violations created legal precedents that would influence prosecutions nationwide. Miss Richardson, Walsh began her direct examination, please tell the court about your father's military training and how it prepared you for the events of October 31st. Emma's voice carried the same steady composure that had frustrated her attackers 6 months earlier. My father, Staff Sergeant Michael Richardson, served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, she explained to the packed courtroom. He taught me that preparation and awareness were essential for survival in hostile environments. I never expected to need those skills at boarding school, but the principles applied regardless of the setting. Her testimony established not just her capabilities, but the systematic nature of the threats she had faced. The defense attorneys representing Brandon, Derek, and Kyle had attempted various strategies to minimize their clients' criminal liability, but the overwhelming digital evidence made traditional approaches impossible. Brandon's lawyer, Thomas Whitfield, had initially planned to argue mutual combat, but the recorded conversations clearly established premeditation and conspiracy. Derek's representation focused on diminished culpability due to peer pressure, while Kyle's team attempted to portray him as a reluctant participant whose technical skills had been exploited by more dominant personalities. Federal prosecutors presented evidence that extended far beyond the Halloween night assault, revealing a systematic campaign of violence that had operated with institutional protection for years. Agent Sarah Martinez testified about the digital forensics that exposed group chats planning, quote, orientation sessions for scholarship students, communications that revealed the organized nature of harassment that administrators had dismissed as typical teenage conflicts. The technical evidence painted a picture of systematic cruelty that contradicted every defense argument about spontaneous or accidental violence. The institutional conspiracy charges against Riverside Preparatory Academy and its administrators proved even more complex, as prosecutors had to demonstrate that school officials had actively enabled civil rights violations rather than simply failing to prevent them. Principal Victoria Hayes faced federal charges for conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and failure to report known criminal activity. Her recorded statements dismissing Emma's complaints as adjustment difficulties provided crucial evidence of institutional intent to suppress legitimate grievances. Emma's testimony about the Academy's response to her harassment reports revealed a systematic pattern of victim blaming and evidence suppression, that had protected wealthy students while endangering vulnerable ones. Every incident I reported was dismissed or minimized, she told the court with clinical precision. Administrators made clear that scholarship students were expected to adapt to whatever treatment they received rather than seek protection through official channels. Her documentation had created an evidentiary foundation that prosecutors used to demonstrate institutional conspiracy. The revelation that Riverside's protective culture had enabled violence against scholarship students for decades brought forward dozens of former victims who had remained silent until Emma's courage gave them hope for justice. Sarah Mitchell, who had transferred from Riverside in 2019 after reporting sexual assault by a prominent donor's son, testified about administrative pressure to recant her allegations. "They told me that false accusations could destroy an innocent young man's future," she explained through tears. "But nobody cared about what the assault had done to mine." Marcus Chen, no relation to Emma's roommate, described systematic harassment that had driven him to attempt suicide during his sophomore year at Riverside. His parents had been told that he was having adjustment difficulties rather than being systematically terrorized by students whose families funded the academy's operations. "The counselors said I needed to try harder to fit in," he testified. "Nobody asked why I was having nightmares or why I stopped eating." His testimony established a pattern of institutional negligence that had endangered vulnerable students for years. The financial investigation into Riverside's operations revealed corruption that extended far beyond enabling harassment, including fraudulent use of federal financial aid funds and tax violations related to charitable donations. Academy administrators had systematically inflated the academic credentials of donor children while suppressing the achievements of scholarship students, creating artificial diversity statistics that qualified the institution for federal grants intended to support disadvantaged populations. Richard Caldwell's construction company faced federal scrutiny for bid-rigging schemes related to academy expansion projects, while his charitable foundation was investigated for tax fraud involving donations that primarily benefited his family's business interests. The web of corruption that Emma's case had exposed touched every aspect of Riverside's operations, from academics to athletics to facilities management. Federal investigators discovered that donor families had essentially purchased immunity for their children through a combination of financial contributions and political influence. The impact on other elite educational institutions was immediate and dramatic, as boarding schools and private academies nationwide implemented new policies to prevent similar federal investigations. The Riverside case became required reading at education law seminars, while federal oversight of private educational institutions increased substantially. Emma's courage had catalyzed systematic reform that extended far beyond her individual case. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had tried to warn Emma about dangerous social dynamics, testified about faculty pressure to minimize harassment reports and avoid creating documentation that might attract external scrutiny. "We were told that too many incident reports would damage the academy's reputation and potentially cost us our jobs," she explained to federal prosecutors. The institutional culture prioritized protecting the school's image over protecting vulnerable students. Her testimony helped establish the systematic nature of administrative negligence. The military-grade fitness tracker that had documented Emma's assault became a central piece of evidence, its sophisticated sensors having recorded biometric data that civilian devices couldn't have captured. Technical experts testified about the device's capabilities, explaining how it had created an irrefutable timeline of events that contradicted defense arguments about consensual conflict or accidental injury. The tracker's emergency protocols had also ensured rapid federal response that prevented evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Emma's cross-examination by defense attorneys lasted 2 grueling days, as expensive legal teams attempted to undermine her credibility and minimize their client's criminal liability. Brendan's lawyer questioned her military training, suggesting that her combat skills made her the aggressor rather than the victim. "Miss Richardson," Whitfield argued, "isn't it true that your tactical training gave you significant advantages over my client and his friends? Doesn't that make you responsible for the violence that occurred?" Emma's response demonstrated the composure that had frustrated her attackers 6 months earlier. "Mr. Whitfield," she replied with clinical precision, "your client and his associates planned to assault me in an isolated location where they believed I would be helpless. My training allowed me to defend myself, but it didn't make me responsible for their premeditated criminal behavior. Self-defense isn't aggression, regardless of the victim's capabilities. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Brandon Caldwell received 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit assault, kidnapping, civil rights violations, and criminal threatening. Derek Thompson was sentenced to 18 years for conspiracy and assault, while Kyle Martinez received 15 years for his role in planning and attempting to document the attack. The sentences sent a clear message that federal courts would not tolerate systematic violence against vulnerable populations, regardless of the perpetrator's family, wealth, or social status. Principal Victoria Hayes received 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy to violate civil rights and obstruction of justice, while other administrators faced varying sentences based on their involvement in covering up systematic abuse. The institutional convictions established legal precedents that would influence how federal prosecutors approached cases involving educational institutions that enabled or concealed civil rights violations. Riverside Preparatory Academy declared bankruptcy within weeks of the federal convictions, its reputation destroyed and its donor base evaporated. The physical campus was eventually sold to the state of Vermont, which converted the facilities into a public educational center focused on supporting students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The transformation from elite exclusivity to inclusive opportunity provided poetic justice that Emma found deeply satisfying. Emma completed her education through a combination of online courses and dual enrollment at the University of Vermont, where she majored in criminal justice with a focus on civil rights law. Her academic achievements earned her full scholarships to multiple law schools, but she chose Harvard specifically because of their clinic programs working with victims of institutional abuse. Her personal experience had given her insights into systematic oppression that traditional legal education couldn't provide. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions resulted in settlements totaling over $40 million, with Emma receiving substantial compensation for the trauma she had endured and the courage she had demonstrated. She used portions of her settlement to establish the Michael and Sarah Richardson Foundation, providing legal support and advocacy for students facing harassment at educational institutions nationwide. The Foundation's 24-hour hotline had helped hundreds of students within its first year of operation. Emma's story became the subject of congressional hearings on violence in educational settings, leading to federal legislation that mandated reporting protocols for harassment incidents and established federal oversight of institutional responses to civil rights complaints. The Richardson Act, as it became known, created legal protections for student whistleblowers and federal funding consequences for institutions that failed to address systematic abuse. The 3 boys who had planned Emma's disappearance discovered that federal prison was significantly different from the privileged environments they had inhabited throughout their lives. Brandon's attempts to maintain his superiority complex were quickly corrected by inmates who had little patience for entitled rich kids who had targeted vulnerable victims. Derek and Kyle adapted more successfully to incarceration, eventually participating in programs designed to address the attitudes and behaviors that had led to their criminal conduct. Richard Caldwell's construction empire collapsed under federal investigation, his assets seized to pay restitution to abused victims and cover legal penalties for corruption charges. The Caldwell name, once synonymous with power and influence in Vermont, became associated with systematic cruelty and institutional corruption. The family's fall from prominence provided a stark lesson about the ultimate fragility of power built on oppression rather than legitimate achievement. Emma's roommate, Sophia Chen, had overcome her initial fear to become a powerful advocate for student safety, establishing peer support networks at multiple educational institutions and working with federal authorities to identify early warning signs of systematic harassment. Her transformation from frightened bystander to courageous activist demonstrated how individual courage could inspire broader social change. Mrs. Susan Palmer, the dorm supervisor who had genuinely cared about Emma's welfare, left education administration to work with the Richardson Foundation, using her institutional knowledge to help other students navigate hostile educational environments. Her experience had taught her that good intentions weren't sufficient without systemic support for protecting vulnerable populations. The Halloween masks that had provided symbolic cover for planned violence had been replaced by transparency requirements that made institutional accountability impossible to avoid. Emma's case had opened windows into educational corruption that federal oversight would ensure remained open permanently, protecting future generations of students from the systematic abuse that had been normalized at elite institutions. Dr. James Morrison, whose family endowment had inadvertently supported an institution that violated civil rights, redirected his charitable giving toward organizations focused on educational equity and student protection. His experience had taught him that financial generosity without oversight could enable rather than prevent institutional abuse. Agent Sarah Martinez received federal recognition for her investigation of the Riverside case, but she considered Emma's courage the most important factor in achieving justice for systematic abuse victims. The case had established protocols for investigating institutional civil rights violations that were being implemented by federal law enforcement agencies nationwide. Emma's fitness tracker, which had transformed from a protective device into crucial evidence, became the basis for new emergency response technologies designed specifically for students facing harassment in educational settings. The device's sophisticated monitoring capabilities had proven that technological innovation could provide protection for vulnerable populations when institutional safeguards failed. The concrete basement where Brandon had planned Emma's imprisonment was eventually demolished during the campus renovation, but its legacy lived on through federal precedents that protected countless students from similar predation. The storage room that was meant to hide evidence of violence had instead preserved documentation that would protect vulnerable students for generations to come. Emma's transformation from invisible scholarship student to national advocate had taken less than a year, but her impact would influence educational institutions and civil rights enforcement for decades. Her father's military training had prepared her to survive individual threats, but her mother's medical background had taught her to diagnose systematic problems that required comprehensive treatment rather than temporary intervention. The federal legislation inspired by Emma's case extended protection beyond educational institutions, establishing frameworks for addressing systematic harassment in any setting where power imbalances might enable abuse. Her courage had catalyzed social change that reached far beyond the Vermont mountains where her ordeal had begun. As Emma prepared for law school, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from victim to advocate, understanding that her father's final lesson had been the most important, that sometimes the greatest service came not from following orders, but from refusing to accept injustice regardless of the personal cost. Her survival had become salvation for countless others who would never face the systematic violence that had been normalized until federal law enforcement restored the rule of law that wealth and privilege had temporarily suspended. The boy who had called her scholarship girl with contempt was now learning about respect in federal prison, while the girl he had tried to destroy was preparing to spend her career ensuring that institutional predators could never again operate with impunity. Emma's refusal to disappear quietly had illuminated corruption that demanded systematic reform, proving that individual courage could indeed change systems that seemed impossible to challenge. 5 years after the Halloween night that shattered Riverside Preparatory Academy's culture of systematic violence, Emma Richardson stood before the United States Supreme Court as the youngest attorney ever to argue a civil rights case involving educational institutions. The case that had brought her to the nation's highest court involved another elite boarding school where wealthy students had terrorized scholarship recipients with impunity. But this time, the institutional response would be different because of the legal precedents established through her own survival and courage. The transformation of American educational oversight had accelerated beyond anything federal prosecutors had anticipated when they first responded to Emma's emergency beacon. The Richardson standards, implemented across all institutions receiving federal funding, required transparent reporting protocols for harassment incidents, mandatory training for administrators on civil rights compliance, and independent oversight boards with authority to investigate complaints without institutional interference. Emma's documentation methods had become standardized procedures taught in educational administration programs nationwide. Chief Justice Patricia Williams, no relation to the interim principal who had briefly replaced Victoria Hayes, questioned Emma about the broader implications of institutional liability for systematic harassment. Counselor Richardson, the Chief Justice, asked, "How does your interpretation of institutional responsibility balance the need to protect vulnerable students against the practical limitations of administrative oversight?" The question went to the heart of legal philosophy that would govern educational institutions for generations. Emma's response drew upon both her personal experience and 5 years of legal education that had transformed her trauma into expertise. "Your Honor," she replied with the same composure that had frustrated her tormentors years earlier, "institutional responsibility isn't about perfect prevention of individual incidents, but about systematic commitment to protecting vulnerable populations when harassment is reported or should have been discovered through reasonable oversight." The Richardson standards establish minimum protocols that any competent administration can implement. The opposing counsel, representing the boarding school whose systematic failures had created the current case, attempted to argue that Emma's interpretation would create impossible liability standards for educational institutions. Ms. Richardson, attorney David Preston challenged, "Doesn't your position essentially make schools liable for any harassment that occurs on their premises regardless of whether administrators could have reasonably prevented it?" His question revealed the fundamental resistance to accountability that had enabled institutional abuse for decades. Emma had anticipated this argument, having encountered similar resistance throughout her legal career. "Mr. Preston," she responded with clinical precision, "the standards don't create liability for harassment itself, but for institutional responses that enable or conceal systematic abuse. When administrators dismiss complaints, destroy evidence, or retaliate against victims, they transform individual incidents into institutional civil rights violations. The liability follows from administrative choices, not from the underlying harassment." The case before the Supreme Court involved Westbrook Academy in Connecticut, where a pattern of abuse remarkably similar to Riverside's had operated until a freshman named Marcus Thompson, Derek's younger brother, had attempted suicide after months of systematic harassment by wealthy classmates. The institutional response had followed the same script that had protected abusers at Riverside: victim blaming, evidence suppression, and administrative denial of systematic problems. The difference this time was that federal investigators had recognized the pattern immediately, applying lessons learned from Emma's case to identify institutional failures before they could escalate to life-threatening violence. The FBI's Educational Civil Rights Task Force, established in response to the Riverside investigation, had developed expertise in recognizing and prosecuting institutional conspiracies that enabled harassment based on economic status, race, or other protected characteristics. Emma's legal career had been shaped by her commitment to transforming institutional culture, rather than simply prosecuting individual cases. The Richardson Foundation's legal clinic had handled over 300 cases involving educational harassment, establishing a network of attorneys specialized in civil rights enforcement that had revolutionized how institutions approached student protection. Her systematic approach to legal advocacy mirrored the tactical thinking her father had taught her during their weekend training sessions. The Supreme Court argument represented more than legal precedent. It embodied the transformation of systematic oppression into systematic protection that Emma's courage had catalyzed. Justice Michael Chen, whose daughter had attended Riverside briefly before transferring due to the hostile culture, understood the personal dimensions of institutional failure. "Counselor Richardson," he asked, "what role should federal oversight play in preventing the kind of institutional culture that enabled your own victimization?" Emma's answer drew upon both legal analysis and lived experience, connecting constitutional principles to practical realities that affected vulnerable students nationwide. "Justice Chen," she replied, "federal oversight provides essential accountability when local systems fail to protect constitutional rights. The Richardson standards establish minimum requirements, but enforcement depends on federal commitment to investigating institutional failures and prosecuting civil rights violations regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or influence." The transformation of individual trauma into systematic reform had required Emma to navigate complex relationships with former classmates whose families had been implicated in Riverside's corruption. Sophia Chen, her former roommate, had become a federal prosecutor specializing in educational civil rights cases, using her insider knowledge of elite institutional culture to identify patterns that might escape detection by investigators from different backgrounds. Their friendship had deepened through shared commitment to protecting vulnerable students. The legal brief Emma had submitted to the Supreme Court included testimony from hundreds of former Riverside students who had remained silent about harassment until her case created safe channels for reporting institutional abuse. The documentation revealed systematic patterns that extended far beyond individual incidents, exposing coordinated campaigns of violence that had operated with administrative protection for decades. Her military-inspired approach to evidence preservation had created an evidentiary foundation that supported constitutional arguments about equal protection and due process. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had tried to warn Emma about dangerous social dynamics at Riverside, had become a leading researcher on institutional culture and harassment prevention. Her academic work had established theoretical frameworks for understanding how elite educational environments could enable systematic abuse, while her practical recommendations had influenced policy implementation across hundreds of institutions. Emma's case taught us that individual courage could expose systematic failures, she explained in her published research, but preventing future abuse required changing institutional incentives rather than depending on victim heroism. The federal legislation inspired by Emma's case had created enforcement mechanisms that extended beyond individual prosecutions to include systematic oversight of institutional culture and administrative practices. The Department of Education's Civil Rights Enforcement Division had expanded dramatically, with specialized teams trained to recognize patterns of institutional harassment and investigate complaints that local authorities might dismiss or suppress. Emma's documentation methods had become standard training for federal investigators. The Supreme Court's eventual decision in Richardson v. Westbrook Academy would establish that educational institutions receiving federal funding had affirmative obligations to identify and address systematic harassment, regardless of whether individual incidents were formally reported through official channels. The ruling strengthened Emma's legal interpretation while creating accountability standards that would protect vulnerable students for generations. Chief Justice Williams noted in her majority opinion that institutional neutrality in the face of systematic oppression constitutes active participation in civil rights violations. Emma's personal journey from scholarship orphan to Supreme Court advocate had required navigating complex emotions about forgiveness, justice, and institutional transformation. She had maintained no contact with Brandon, Derek, or Kyle during their federal incarceration, but had corresponded with family members who sought to understand how their wealth and privilege had enabled systematic cruelty. Her responses had emphasized restorative rather than purely punitive approaches to addressing institutional failures. The military fitness tracker that had documented her assault and triggered federal response had evolved into sophisticated monitoring systems designed specifically for educational environments. The Richardson device, as it had become known, provided discrete emergency communication capabilities for students facing harassment, while creating digital evidence that prosecutors could use to establish patterns of institutional negligence. The technology had saved dozens of students from violence, while providing law enforcement with tools to identify systematic abuse. Richard Caldwell had served his federal sentence for corruption and conspiracy, emerging from prison to discover that his family's reputation could never be restored through traditional means. His public speaking engagements about wealthy privilege and institutional accountability had provided some measure of redemption, though Emma doubted whether his change was genuine or strategic. She had chosen to focus on preventing future abuse rather than monitoring former perpetrators' rehabilitation efforts. The basement storage room where Emma had defended herself against planned assault had been preserved as evidence during Riverside's federal investigation, its concrete walls bearing witness to the moment when systematic oppression had encountered individual resistance and institutional corruption had been exposed to federal scrutiny. The space had eventually been converted into a memorial garden honoring students who had suffered harassment at educational institutions, with Emma's name prominently displayed among hundreds of others who had found courage to speak truth about institutional failures. Emma's law school graduation from Harvard had been attended by dozens of students whose cases she had supported through the Richardson Foundation, creating a network of advocates committed to transforming educational culture through legal accountability and systematic reform. Her thesis on institutional civil rights liability had been published by the Harvard Law Review and cited in federal court decisions nationwide, establishing her academic credentials alongside her practical experience as a harassment survivor and civil rights advocate. The congressional testimony Emma had provided about educational violence had influenced multiple pieces of federal legislation extending beyond the Richardson Act to include broader protections for vulnerable populations in institutional settings. Her systematic approach to documenting harassment and analyzing institutional responses had created frameworks that federal agencies use to investigate complaints involving systematic discrimination based on economic status, race, gender, or other protected characteristics. The Halloween masquerade ball that had provided cover for planned violence against Emma had been replaced at institutions nationwide by structured social activities designed to promote inclusion rather than exclude vulnerable students. The symbolic significance of masks concealing predatory intentions had influenced educational policies that emphasized transparency and accountability rather than maintaining facades that protected systematic abuse. Mrs. Susan Palmer, the dorm supervisor who had genuinely cared about student welfare but felt powerless within Riverside's corrupt system, had become a leading advocate for employee protection when reporting institutional harassment. Her experience had taught her that protecting students required protecting staff members who might face retaliation for documenting or reporting administrative failures. The Palmer Protocols, as they became known, created federal protections for educational employees who reported civil rights violations. The transformation of elite educational culture had extended beyond harassment prevention to include broader questions about accessibility, opportunity, and institutional mission. Emma's case had exposed how donor influence could corrupt academic integrity, while systematic harassment eliminated talented students who threatened established social hierarchies. The Richardson standards required institutions to demonstrate that their admissions, disciplinary, and academic practices served educational rather than social purposes. Agent Sarah Martinez had received federal recognition for developing investigative protocols that had revolutionized how law enforcement approached institutional civil rights violations. Her systematic approach to documenting harassment patterns and analyzing administrative responses had created evidentiary standards that made prosecution of institutional conspiracy cases significantly more effective. Emma's case had provided the foundational precedents that influenced hundreds of subsequent investigations. The fitness tracker data that had documented Emma's assault with military precision had established new legal standards for digital evidence in civil rights cases, while the emergency response protocols her father had programmed had saved dozens of students whose harassment escalated to life-threatening violence. The technological innovation had created protection mechanisms that vulnerable populations could access when institutional safeguards failed to provide adequate security. Emma's Supreme Court argument had concluded with a personal reflection on the transformation from victim to advocate that her father's training had made possible. "Your Honors," she had said in closing, "individual courage can expose systematic failures, but preventing future abuse requires institutional commitment to protecting vulnerable populations regardless of their economic status or social influence. The Constitution guarantees equal protection under law, but enforcement depends on federal commitment to investigating and prosecuting violations wherever they occur." Quote, "The Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Richardson v. Westbrook Academy had established that Emma's interpretation of institutional civil rights liability represented the legal standard that would govern educational institutions receiving federal funding. The ruling created accountability mechanisms that would protect vulnerable students while providing institutions with clear guidance about their legal obligations to prevent and address systematic harassment." 5 years after the Halloween night that had changed everything, Emma reflected on the journey from darkness to advocacy that her survival had made possible. The storage room where she had faced 3 predators with lethal training had become a symbol of resistance against institutional oppression, while her refusal to disappear quietly had illuminated systematic corruption that federal law enforcement had dismantled through sustained investigation and prosecution. The boys who had planned her assault were scheduled for release from federal prison within the next decade, their sentences reduced through participation in rehabilitation programs designed to address the attitudes and behaviors that had led to their criminal conduct. Emma had chosen to focus on preventing future abuse rather than monitoring former perpetrators, understanding that institutional transformation required forward-looking solutions rather than backward-looking punishment. The military training that had saved Emma's life during the assault had evolved into comprehensive self-defense education that the Richardson Foundation provided to vulnerable students nationwide. The programs emphasized situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, and emergency response protocols while teaching participants to document harassment incidents and access legal resources when institutional protection failed to materialize. Emma's wedding to Jason Park, the quiet student who had documented everything and become a key federal witness, had been attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been transformed by her courage and advocacy. Their relationship had developed through shared commitment to protecting vulnerable populations, while their partnership had created a model for how individual trauma could become collective healing through systematic reform and institutional accountability. The Richardson Foundation's 24-hour hotline had handled thousands of calls from students facing harassment at educational institutions, while its legal clinic had established precedents that strengthened civil rights enforcement nationwide. Emma's systematic approach to documenting institutional failures had created resources that vulnerable students could access when local authorities failed to provide adequate protection or investigation. The concrete basement that had contained Emma's resistance against planned violence had been transformed into a symbol of hope for vulnerable students who faced systematic harassment with limited institutional support. Her refusal to be intimidated had created legal precedents and enforcement mechanisms that would protect countless future students from the predatory behavior that had been normalized at elite institutions until federal law enforcement restored constitutional protections. The Halloween masks that had provided symbolic cover for planned assault had been replaced by transparency requirements that made institutional accountability impossible to avoid permanently. Emma's documentation of systematic harassment had opened windows into educational corruption that federal oversight would ensure remained open, protecting vulnerable populations from predatory behavior that had operated with impunity until individual courage had challenged institutional failures. As Emma prepared for her next Supreme Court argument involving workplace harassment at federal agencies, she understood that her father's final lesson had been the most important, that sometimes the greatest service came not from following orders but from refusing to accept injustice regardless of personal cost. Her survival had become salvation for countless others who would never face the systematic violence that had been normalized until one person's courage had catalyzed the institutional transformation that made protection, rather than predation, the standard for educational environments. The storage room where 3 predators had planned her disappearance had instead preserved evidence that would protect vulnerable students for generations, while her tactical training had transformed individual survival into systematic reform that reached every corner of American educational culture. Emma's journey from invisible scholarship student to Supreme Court advocate had taken only 5 years, but her impact would influence institutional accountability and civil rights enforcement for decades to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.